The video footage was grainy but unmistakable. A small boy, her son, stood trembling in the corner of a lavish living room, while an older child shoved him again and again. In the background, an elegant woman, perfectly poised in pearls and a cashmere sweater, watched silently and smiled. Bethany froze as she watched bile rising in her throat. That was her mother-in-law, and that was her child being hurt not just once, but systematically. What had they done to him? Why had Finn stopped hugging her during visits? Why did he flinch when she reached for his hand? How do you fight monsters who wear designer clothes and sit on charity boards? If you believe every mother deserves to protect her child no matter the odds, leave a comment and subscribe. This story is for the ones who refuse to stay silent. Bethany was never what the Grant family wanted for their golden boy. A public school girl turned sharp-minded journalist, she was smart-driven and came from the wrong side of town. But that didn't stop Daniel Grant, their beloved son, from falling hard for her. They married, had Finn, and built a life full of love until the car crash stole Daniel away. In the wake of his death, Bethany hoped grief would bring the family closer. Instead, it became a weapon. "You're not stable," they told her. "Finn needs structure. He needs us." With money, power, and an army of lawyers, the Grants pushed Bethany out of the estate and into supervised visits. Alone, broke, and grieving, she was painted as the fragile widow, unfit, unstable, unnecessary. But Bethany knew something the court didn't. Her son was changing. His eyes lost their light. He whispered things in the dark. And when she saw the bruises, the truth began to crack through the image of the perfect Grant family. And so begins the story of a mother stripped of everything except her fire. In part 2, we'll uncover how Bethany lost custody and why she never gave up. Bethany still remembered the first dinner with the Grant family. She had worn her best navy dress and straightened her hair 3 times to calm her nerves. But it didn't matter. Nothing could have masked the silent judgment hanging in the air like stale perfume. "I thought Daniel said you were a writer," Margaret Grant, Daniel's mother, had said, stabbing her salad. "You mean, like blogs?" Her laugh was brittle, her smile tight. The others followed suit. That night, Bethany felt the chill that would follow her for years. She wasn't one of them. She was an outsider who dared to marry into wealth, and they would never let her forget it. Still, she tried. For Daniel, for Finn. They were a happy family, Bethany, Daniel, and little Finn. Their apartment in the city was modest but warm. Daniel worked long hours at the family's corporate investment firm, but he always made time to read bedtime stories. Bethany freelanced for local magazines, slowly building a portfolio and caring for Finn full-time. But the Grants viewed motherhood as a luxury and Bethany as lazy. "You should be contributing more," Margaret would sneer at family gatherings. "Daniel's carrying you." Once Daniel overheard and defended her. The next day, he came home silent, distant, shaken. The family had reminded him who paid for his education, his car, his life. Then came the accident. A rainy afternoon, a missed turn. Daniel was gone, just like that. The grief was crushing, but the betrayal came fast and sharp. Margaret arrived at the hospital, not with flowers but a lawyer. "We need to talk about the future," she said, eyes dry. "Finn will stay with us. You need to focus on healing. We'll handle everything." Bethany thought it was grief talking. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, she was handed a court notice. The Grants were seeking full custody. Her stomach dropped. No warning, no conversation. Just action, cold and calculated. They claimed she was unstable, that she had no job, no home, no support system, and technically they were right. The apartment had been in Daniel's name. The money in their shared account had been frozen for legal review. Her only family? A mother who passed from cancer years ago. She had no siblings, no backup. Her world crumbled fast. At the first hearing, Margaret's attorney painted a picture of a grieving woman spiraling, unable to care for a child. Photos of her crying at Daniel's grave, medical records of her briefly seeking therapy, even a private investigator's report showing her crying on a park bench while Finn played. Bethany's own lawyer, court-appointed and overwhelmed, barely made a dent. The judge, a former colleague of Margaret's brother-in-law, ruled temporary custody in favor of the Grants until further review. Bethany would have weekend visits under supervision. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She wasn't a danger to Finn. She was his mother. But the world didn't care about grief-stricken mothers without resources. The Grants had wealth, reputation, and connection. Bethany had heart, and that for now wasn't enough. She found a room to rent from an old college friend who felt sorry for her. She took freelance jobs editing wedding speeches, ghostwriting blogs, proofreading. Every dime went to legal fees and groceries for her brief visits with Finn. But something was changing. At first, Finn would run into her arms when she came. But slowly, week after week, he grew quieter. He stopped drawing smiley faces. He spoke in short sentences. He flinched when she touched his hair. One night she asked if he was okay. He shook his head. "Cousin Luke says I have to toughen up. He locks me in the bathroom sometimes, says boys shouldn't cry." Bethany's blood ran cold. She hugged her son tightly, heart pounding, but when she told the Grants, they dismissed it. "Boys play rough." The uncle laughed. "Luke's just teaching him to stand up for himself." Margaret's response. "Maybe if you hadn't raised him so soft." Bethany reported it to Child Services. The case was opened and quietly closed 2 weeks later. Insufficient evidence. The file disappeared. But she knew what she heard. She knew what she saw. The bruises. The way Finn began drawing pictures of a stick figure alone in the dark. The time he asked her, "If I disappear, will you look for me?" Bethany started documenting everything. She wrote down every word Finn said. She recorded her conversations with the Grants. She met a woman online, a former nanny who claimed she'd been fired after confronting Margaret about how Finn was treated. And then came the video, leaked from an anonymous email. A security camera inside the Grant home. Clear as day, Finn being shoved, crying, begging. And in the background, Margaret sipping tea, smiling. Bethany begins to fight back with allies' evidence and a mother's fury. The battle for Finn truly begins. Bethany sat on the edge of her narrow twin bed, the only furniture in her rented room, besides a desk stacked with case files, coloring books, and half-drunk coffee cups. She replayed the video over and over. Finn crying, Luke's cruel voice, and Margaret smiling. That image burned in her mind like acid. She could feel the old Bethany slipping away, the one who had begged the Grants to be reasonable, the one who had shown up in court, hopeful, trusting that truth would speak for itself. That Bethany was gone. This version of her, she was done playing nice. She uploaded the video to a secure drive and sent a copy to an old friend, Talia Vega, a civil rights attorney she'd known back in college. They hadn't spoken in years, not since graduation, but Talia had always said, "If you ever need someone to burn the system down with you, call me." Now she did. Within 48 hours, Talia flew in from Chicago, reviewed the documents, and said, "We don't take this to their court, we take it to ours." Different county, different jurisdiction, different judge. They filed a petition for emergency custody in a rural county 2 hours away where Bethany had once been a resident. It was a legal gamble, but Talia knew the law inside out. The Grants have influence, but influence weakens the farther it gets from the country club, she said. They also reached out to a nonprofit that specialized in child abuse advocacy. Through them, Bethany was able to get Finn evaluated by a trauma-informed child psychologist, one of the best in the state. The psychologist's findings were clear and damning. Finn showed signs of prolonged psychological harm, consistent with coercion, isolation, and chronic stress from an unsafe home environment. Meanwhile, Bethany kept building her case like a journalist chasing the biggest story of her life. She tracked down a former teacher of Finn's who had once flagged bruises but had been quietly let go weeks later. She found a pediatric nurse who'd treated Finn for a sprained wrist and remembered how Margaret insisted the injury was from a fall at recess, even as Finn refused to make eye contact. But the biggest shock came when the former nanny, the one Bethany had found online, agreed to meet. Her name was Delilah Carr, and she'd worked for the Grants for nearly 3 years. Quiet, nervous, but with a fierce glint in her eyes, Delilah handed over a flash drive. "I kept these," she said. I knew someday someone would need the truth. The flash drive contained time-stamped audio recordings, arguments between Margaret and her husband about Finn's behavior. Screaming, threats. A voice, Luke's mocking Finn, calling him names. And Margaret's voice saying coldly, "He needs to toughen up. He won't survive in this family otherwise." Bethany's hands shook as she listened. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I tried, Delilah said. But nothing stuck. They're grants. They make things disappear. Now, however, the grants couldn't make everything disappear, especially not when Bethany and Talia made the boldest move yet. They released the story online, anonymously. Bethany wrote a raw, unfiltered blog post under the title, "When the People Who Raise Your Child Aren't Protecting Them." She changed names, locations, but kept the heart of it true. She included descriptions of what Finn had been through, the fight she was waging, the roadblocks faced by mothers with no money and no voice. The post went viral. Thousands of comments flooded in, mothers, teachers, child advocates, even former nannies, sharing eerily similar experiences with elite families. The story made its way into parenting forums, subreddits, even local news. While no one knew the grants by name, whispers began in the right circles. And then came the twist Bethany never saw coming. A woman named Caroline Monroe messaged her anonymously. She claimed to be Margaret Grant's former daughter-in-law. She said, "They took my kids too. They did to me what they're doing to you, and I can prove it." Bethany and Talia met her in a diner off the interstate. Caroline was thin, sharp-eyed, and clearly had been through hell. She showed them court transcripts, hospital records, even a psychiatric evaluation she'd been forced to undergo after Margaret accused her of postpartum psychosis. Nothing had ever stuck, but she had kept everything. They added her testimony to the case. Finally, court day arrived. The Grants tried to delay. They filed a motion to dismiss, hired 3 new lawyers, and even tried to settle out of court. But Bethany refused. She didn't want money. She wanted Finn. In the packed courtroom, it all came out, witness after witness, evidence after evidence. The judge, unimpressed by the Grants' polished performance, listened closely as Finn's psychologist read aloud his findings. "This child has been silenced in every possible way. But his drawings, his words, they're screaming." Bethany took the stand last. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I may not have money or power, but I have something they never will, truth. And a mother's truth is louder than all their lies." The room was still. Even Margaret's face cracked just slightly. The courtroom turns into a battlefield where the Grants fight back harder than ever, but Bethany refuses to back down. The second day in court opened with tension so thick it felt like fog pressing against the walls. Bethany sat at the plaintiff's table in a plain navy dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Talia sat beside her, cool and collected, but even she was breathing a little harder than usual. Across the aisle, the Grants had come in full armor, Margaret, in a tailored cream suit and cold pearls, Luke smug in a crisp blazer, and their legal team doubled overnight. They weren't here to fight fair. They were here to destroy, and their opening move was brutal. Margaret's attorney stood and requested that Bethany's parental rights be suspended, immediately citing questionable mental stability and an online campaign intended to manipulate public perception and intimidate witnesses. They referenced her anonymous blog post, twisted it, and presented it as a calculated act of defamation. They even dragged up an old prescription Bethany had once taken for anxiety after the car accident. The courtroom murmured. Then they dropped the hammer. A witness, Bethany's former landlord, claimed she'd heard screaming from Bethany's room at night and that Bethany talked to herself often. It was ridiculous and deliberate. Bethany's heart pounded, her throat tightened. Was this how they fought lies, half-truths, character assassination? She tried to keep calm, but Margaret wouldn't stop staring at her with that frozen smile. That smile that said, "You think you're winning, watch this." Then came the testimony. Bethany dreaded most. Luke took the stand. He painted himself as a concerned uncle claiming Finn had frequent nightmares because of his mother's instability and accused Bethany of coaching the boy to lie. He even looked at the judge and said with mock emotion, "We just want what's best for Finn. That's all we've ever wanted." Bethany clenched her jaw so hard she tasted blood. Talia rose for cross-examination and did her best to dismantle his performance, but the damage was done. For the first time, Bethany could feel the balance shift. The judge had gone from neutral to uncertain. After recess, Margaret took the stand. She was poised, polite, and painted herself as a woman of faith who had welcomed Bethany into our family despite her background. She said in a controlled tone, Bethany was always distant, unreliable, emotionally erratic. After my son died, we were forced to step in. Not because we wanted to take her child, but because someone had to be responsible. Bethany could hardly breathe. She wanted to scream, to stand up and tell the world everything she knew. But she also knew this wasn't the moment to explode. This was the moment to endure. Still, something broke in her, then not her will, but her fear. That night she sat alone in her car outside the courthouse. Her phone buzzed with new messages, support from online followers, messages from other mothers, a voicemail from the social worker who said Finn had asked if she was okay. And that was when it hit her. She wasn't doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for him. For Finn. She whispered into the night voice hoarse, "No matter what they throw at me, I'm not leaving you behind." The next day, Bethany asked to be called back to the stand against Talia's advice. "They'll keep going for your throat," Talia warned. "You don't owe them anything." "I'm not doing it for them," Bethany replied. "I'm doing it for the judge and for my son. He needs to hear me fight." She stepped up. This time, she didn't come armed with documents or legal arguments. She came with truth. "I've been called unstable. I've been accused of turning my child against his family," Bethany said, voice trembling. "But the truth is, I was silent for too long. I let them control the narrative. I let them make me small, and in doing that, I let my son suffer." She paused. "They can say whatever they want about me, that I was poor, that I wasn't good enough, that I lost my temper. You know what? Maybe I did. Maybe I wasn't perfect. But I never hurt my son. I never locked him in a room. I never made him cry himself to sleep. And I never taught him to fear his own voice." She locked eyes with the judge. "All I ever did was fight for him, even when no one fought for me." Silence, thick and heavy. Across the room, Luke shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's lips were tight. Then something unexpected happened. From the back of the courtroom, a hand raised. A woman stood. It was Caroline Monroe, the former daughter-in-law. "I know I wasn't called to testify," she said shakily. "But I was married into that family too. I lost everything just like Bethany. And I've stayed silent for 10 years. No more." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. With the judge's permission, Caroline took the stand. Her voice was quiet, but every word cut like glass. She described the exact same patterns: emotional manipulation, forced psychiatric evaluations, false reports. She showed pictures of her own son covered in bruises, and how the Grants had called it roughhousing. It wasn't just Bethany anymore. It was a pattern, a legacy of control, cruelty, and silence. By the end of the day, the tide had turned again. The judge announced he needed 48 hours to review all testimony before rendering a decision. Outside the courthouse, reporters were now circling. Bethany didn't speak to them. She simply stood there in the sunlight, tired but unwavering, and whispered to herself, "We're almost there, baby. Mama's almost bringing you home." The final decision is made, and Bethany faces a choice that will change not only her life, but Finn's future forever. The morning of the final court session was quiet, too quiet. Bethany woke before dawn in her tiny rented room, the one she'd fought so hard to afford, after being forced out of the Grant mansion. The air was still. No buzzing phone, no messages, just silence. She stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. In a few hours, a judge would decide whether she could be a mother again, not in name, in truth. But something in her had shifted since that last courtroom scene. Not fear, not doubt, something deeper, resolve. For the first time in over a year, Bethany wasn't afraid of losing everything, because she realized she never had everything to begin with. She had been clinging to the idea of safety, of reputation, of being good enough in a world that was rigged against her from the start. Now she was fighting for something pure, not image, not validation, just love. Later that morning, she met Talia outside the courthouse. The lawyer handed her a cup of coffee and gave her a long look. "You know," Talia said, "I've worked with dozens of women in family court. Most give up after one blow. You took 10 punches and still got up." Bethany smiled weakly. "I didn't have a choice." "That's where you're wrong," Talia replied. "You did. And that's what makes you dangerous to people like them." They walked into the courtroom together. No cameras today, just quiet anticipation. The judge entered, papers shuffled, a deep breath, and then, in the matter of custody of minor child Finn Grant, Bethany's fingers dug into the edge of her seat. The court finds sufficient cause to believe that emotional and psychological harm has occurred while under the care of the Grant household. Margaret's head turned sharply. Luke stiffened. "And therefore full legal and physical custody is hereby granted to the biological mother Bethany Moore, effective immediately." The words didn't land at first. They echoed in Bethany's ears like distant thunder. Her eyes filled, but she blinked hard. She didn't want tears, not yet. Margaret stood and muttered something under her breath, but the judge slammed the gavel. "Court is adjourned." The room erupted in whispers. Talia squeezed Bethany's arm. "You did it." "No," Bethany whispered back. "We did." But even in that victory, Bethany knew the story wasn't over. Finn wasn't just coming home to hugs and sunshine. He was coming home from a battlefield carrying wounds no child should ever have to explain. That night back in her apartment, Bethany sat on the floor of Finn's tiny, freshly cleaned room. His toys, old but loved, lined the shelves. A lamp with little rockets. A drawing on the wall he'd made during one of their supervised visits, her and him hand in hand with a giant sun above. She heard a knock. It wasn't loud, just soft, hesitant. She opened the door. Finn stood there clutching a backpack almost as big as him. Behind him, a social worker gave her a quiet nod and stepped back. "Hi, baby," Bethany whispered. He blinked up at her. Then slowly, he stepped forward. She knelt. He threw his arms around her neck. That night, he didn't say much. He just lay beside her in bed, his hand clutched in hers, whispering, "You came back." Bethany kissed the top of his head. "I never left." But in the days that followed, the weight of everything she'd fought through began to settle. Finn had nightmares. He flinched at loud sounds. He asked if he was allowed to cry. Bethany realized winning custody wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of healing, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. One afternoon, while Finn was drawing quietly, Bethany sat down at her laptop. She opened a blank document. At the top, she typed, "You're not crazy, a mother's guide to surviving family court." Then she called Caroline Monroe. The other woman answered quickly. "Bethany, I'm starting something," Bethany said. "A blog, maybe more. A place for moms like us, maybe even a hotline eventually." Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "About damn time." With Caroline's help and Talia's input, Bethany launched the site. She posted her full story under her real name. No more hiding, no more silence. The response was overwhelming. Women from across the country wrote in thanking her, asking for advice, sharing their own stories. Bethany didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. Her worth was never defined by what the Grants thought of her, or what the court once believed, or even by the lies told in whispers. It was defined by the boy now sleeping peacefully in the next room, and by the fire inside her that refused to go out. Bethany turns her pain into purpose and faces the final confrontation with the family that once tried to erase her. 2 weeks after Bethany's custody victory, the Grants received an unexpected knock on their towering mahogany door. It wasn't a delivery, it wasn't press. It was the Department of Child Welfare escorted by 2 uniformed officers. A formal investigation had been opened not just into Finn's case, but into several anonymous tips regarding child development camps run by the Grants Charitable Foundation. Camps that had long been whispered about but never challenged until now. Margaret Grant stood frozen in her designer heels as officers handed her a warrant. Luke, once smug and untouchable, now stared down at the ground like a boy caught cheating on a test. The footage Bethany had leaked strategically and anonymously through a network of advocacy groups had gone viral. News anchors dissected it nightly, a child being locked in a soundproof wine cellar, a grandmother smiling in the background. Public sympathy, once on the Grants' side, evaporated. Sponsors pulled out. Their luxury charity gala was canceled. A prominent board member stepped down in shame. Bethany, meanwhile, remained quiet. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was loud enough. Instead, she focused on her blog and the growing community of women rallying around her. She gave interviews, but only to platforms that empowered survivors, not tabloids chasing scandal. She never once mentioned the Grants by name, but they felt every word. One particular video where Bethany talked about what healing looks like struck a chord. It ended with her staring straight into the camera and saying, "Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who smile the brightest in public. But that smile, it won't protect them forever." It was clipped, shared, and turned into a rallying cry. Meanwhile, at home, Finn slowly began to laugh again. He made friends. He slept through the night. Bethany watched her son bloom, and with him a piece of her soul finally began to feel whole again. Bethany closes this chapter of her life and leaves you with the message that healing is the truest form of revenge. A year later, Bethany stood in front of a small group of mothers at a local support center, many with tired eyes and trembling voices, just like she once had. Finn waited just outside, drawing sunflowers and rocket ships. He no longer drew shadows with padlocks or faceless boys with clenched fists. Bethany shared her story not with bitterness, but with clarity. She spoke not to relive the pain, but to show the possibility of life after it. She had learned that freedom isn't always a grand escape. It's in the everyday choices to say no more. No more gaslighting. No more silence. No more shrinking to fit into someone else's version of enough. She smiled as she said, "The moment I stopped fighting to prove my worth and started fighting to protect my peace, everything changed." That was her justice. That was her victory. If you've ever felt unseen or unheard, know this: your voice matters. And when you use it, you don't just heal yourself, you light the way for someone else. If Bethany's story moved you, share your own. Like, comment, or subscribe. You never know who needs to hear it.